Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim, Daf Kuf Yud Daled. Today's daf is sponsored by Suri Stern in loving memory of her father, Harav Reuven ben Chaim. Still inspiring me with your cycles of Shas and Ahavat HaBriyot. Okay, we'll get started with the bottom of yesterday's daf, the very, very bottom. So we're continuing on in the Mishnayot. If you remember, in the first part of the Mishnah, which we already dealt with, we talked about two types of animals, the para aduma and the sira mishtalech, which are not relevant to all these laws of chutz. Again, that's going to be our whole topic. Sacrificing something outside the temple, they're not relevant because it says al petach ol moed lo hevio. And these are, right, it has to be something that was supposed to go into ol moed, and these were never relevant to go into ol moed. Now we get to, even though we did talk about what about the sira mishtalech, theoretically at the beginning it was, and then we ended with saying, well, at a later point it wasn't. And that's why we need another source, remember, because at an earlier point, actually, it is, and therefore they learn it from the Korban Hashem. Similarly, we're going to do with the next section, because the next section is the Rovea, Nirba, Muktzah, Neva, Mechir, Etnan, Kilaim, Trefa, Yotzei, Dofen. All of these are animals disqualified in the altar, all for kind of different reasons, but they're all animals that cannot go on the altar. And you would expect the Mishnah to say, okay, these can't be brought to Ol Moed, so what do you expect it to say? Because it says Ol Moed Lo Hevio. And because you can't bring these to Ol Moed, therefore you can't, you're not liable for offering them outside. But that's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says, if you go back to Kuf Yud Amud Aleph, and if you don't want to turn back, I'll read it to you. Okay, you're going to be patur for all those if you offer them outside, because they're not even liable to be offered inside. But not because it says El Ol Moed Lo Hevio, and therefore these psukim are relevant. But Shene'amar Lifnei Mishkan Hashem, because they can't be brought before the dwelling place of God. Meaning you can't offer them on the altar inside. Because you can't offer them on the altar inside, you can't go outside. But why didn't they learn it from Ol Moed? And that's the Gemara's question. Hanami, last words of yesterday's daf. Hanami tepuchlemi petach Ol Moed. Why aren't these learned out from petach Ol Moed? So they say, Bishlama rovea v'nirba. Mishkachale dakdishinu mi'ikara v'hadar rav'u. Okay. We're now going to have to go through the list and differentiate between the different cases. Rovev and Yerba is an animal that engages in bestiality either actively or passively. Well, you could have a case where it actually is. What we're going to have to find here in all these cases is there must be some unique situation, could be unique, not unique, but some situation where it actually could have been brought to Ol Moed at some point. It was, now, anything theoretically, once it's born, right, could be. But we mean from the time it was consecrated. So we have to have an item that was consecrated. When it was consecrated, when we took the animal, we said, I'm going to bring this as a sacrifice. It could have gone to Ol Moed. Could have been brought. And then became disqualified later. And that's why that's not going to work to use that pasuk to remove it. Because if we used Ol Moed Lo Hevio, you add, and then that means it only is something that could have been brought and you didn't bring. Well, this could have been brought and you didn't bring it. So that's not going to work because the Rovev and Yerba, you could have designated the animal to be a korban. And it was Ro'oid could have gone at that point to Ol Moed. And then after that moment in time, it then engaged in bestiality. So that would then not be excluded by Ol Moed Lo Hevio, because since you could have originally, maybe when you later do it and sacrifice it outside, you'll actually be liable. That's what we need Mishkan Hashem to tell you no, because in the end, this can't go to Mishkan Hashem. This can't be brought on the altar, can't be brought as a sacrifice to God, Lifnei Mishkan Hashem. Therefore, it's out. So that's why we need the extra pasuk for Rovev and Nirba. But we're going to have a problem with the next category, Muktzah v'ne'avad. Ela Muktzah v'ne'avad. Okay, so again, Mishkachala da'akdeshinu, Bishlama Rovev and Nirba. That one works because you could have it where akdeshinu, you sanctified it. You said, I'm bringing this as an animal on the altar, me'ikara from the beginning, v'hadar ravu, and after that, it engaged in bestiality. And for that, you need the other pasuk. Ela muktzah v'ne'avad, but now we're going to have a problem. What's muktzah v'ne'avad? Muktzah v'ne'avad it is something happened to it, but it's different. This is all designated by someone. Someone came and said, I'm going to use this for idol worship, or I'm going to designate it to be used for idol worship. That's muktzah. It was just designated, even without being worshipped. The other is someone took it and worshipped it. Now this can't happen in a case like the previous one. Why? You'll see in a minute. Ein adam oser davar she'eno shelo. Okay, this is something we learned. It's like a property law. I can't take your item, go into your house, and just say, oh, by the way, I'm worshiping idols with this. It's not mine to do that. So likewise here, if I sanctify it and we try to fit it into the same exact structure as the previous, we're going to say you sanctify the animal, and then after sanctifying it, you designated it for idol worship. Well, your designation is irrelevant. Or even if you used it for idol worship, it's irrelevant because you can't forbid something that's not yours. And once you designate this animal for the temple, it belongs to the temple. It doesn't belong to you anymore. You're no longer the owner of it. So if you or anybody else does something with it for idol worship, it's an irrelevant action because no one, ein adam oser devar she'eino shelo. You can't take something that's not yours. It's not yours to take, to forbid. To which they answer, well, it depends what kind of kachim you're talking about. And it depends whose opinion you hold by. We could find a case, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that it could be that you could actually, your designation would be relevant or your idol worship would be relevant and would forbid the item. Because it could be Bekodshim Kalim, Va'aliba de Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Da'amar, Kodshim Kalim, Mamon Ba'alimhu. You might remember we had this discussion. Shlamim is something that I'm going to eventually eat the meat of, right? That's a classic case of Kodshim Kalim, okay? Bechor, Maser, those also. They belong to the person who sacrifices because in the end they're going to eat the meat. Because in the end they're going to eat the meat, there's this big debate. Part of it's going to be offered on the altar, the imurim, right, those fatty parts. Part of it is going to be eaten by the owner. So do we call this the owner's or do we call it belonging to God? There's two ways to look at it. Either it belongs to me, I just have to bring some of it on the altar, in which case it's mine, in which case if I then decide I'm going to use it for idol worship, that's effective. Okay, it doesn't mean I can worship idols if I want with it, okay? I mean, obviously I can't, it's forbidden. But the question is, does that mean that this item is considered an item used for idol worship? Because if it's not mine, just like I said, if I walk into your house and I take your item and I use it for idol worship, you can just take it back and benefit from it. There's no prohibition on that, which normally anything that was used for idol worship was prohibited, because I had no rights to do that. I can't just come into your house and take your stuff. Likewise, I can't go into take temple stuff and do that with. But if we view it as mine, which is what Rabbi Yossi Aglili says in a minute, we'll see his proof. If I view it as mine, and it's just that some of it needs to be offered on the altar, then yeah, if I said I'm going to worship idols with it, or actually I worship idols with it, it's going to be forbidden. The alternative approach, which we're not going to see inside, is that it belongs to God, and just I'm allowed to eat from the Shulchan Gavoa. In other words, it belongs to the Gavoa, okay, however we say whether it's God, the temple, however we define that. But it doesn't belong to me, but there is part of it that they allow me to eat. Then I can't turn it into avodah zarah. Okay? But if we explain our Mishnah matches Rabbi Yossi Aglili's opinion, and it's a case of Kodshim Kalim only. Okay, that's, in other words, again, that would be the case where we would need the pasuk Lifnei Mishkan Hashem to exclude it from the laws of chutz. Because it was ra'oi lavo la'ol moed, because when I designated it, it was completely fine, and then later I messed it up. And that's why we wouldn't learn it from Ohel Moed. Okay. Now we're going to see the source where Rabbi Yossi Aglili gets this from, that it belongs to the person. Okay, because it says, D'Tanya. Now we're going to quote a pasuk that we've seen before. It's about when you're chayiv an asham, korban asham for an asham. There's asham me'ilot, which is misuse consecrated property. That's not this. This is a korban asham gzelot, it's called. If I steal something and I deny that I stole it, and then I come forward and I admit that I lied under oath, then I bring a korban asham. But the pasuk there says something interesting. It starts off with nefesh ki techta, okay, a person who sins, u'ma'ala ma'al b'Hashem. Okay, it's Vayikra Hey 21. Now, what's this ma'ala ma'al b'Hashem? It's not b'Hashem, and it's not a me'ila. Okay, v'chichesh ba'amito, and denies his friend a claim, b'pikadon, or b'tzumet yad, or b'gazel, or ashokat amito. Okay, something you gave me to watch, and I said, I don't have it, and I lie under oath, and then I admit, or I steal, okay, whatever all the cases are. But why does it say ma'ala ma'al b'Hashem? What does that have to do with anything? So in the Bright it says, ma'ala ma'al b'Hashem, l'rabot kodshim kalim shehem amono divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. He says, why does it bring up this ma'ala ma'al b'Hashem? Because it must be referring to something that belongs to God, somewhat belongs to God, but not really belongs to God, which is the korban kodshim. Kodshim kalim, the shlamim. If I steal your korban shlamim, and then I deny that I stole it, and then I admit that I was lying under oath, I would have to bring an Asham Gzelo. Now the pasuk clearly says ba'amito, chichesh ba'amito, to his friend. That would be theoretically, if you say it all belongs to God, it would be against God. That wouldn't be in this pasuk. That's not what this pasuk is talking about. The fact that Rabbi Yosef Glees says that's what the pasuk is talking about. That's why it says ma'ala ma'al ba'Hashem in the pasuk, to include a case of something that is sanctified. So then it would be kodshim kalim, because it still belongs to your friend, even though it's sanctified. And that's exactly his proof. Okay, now we go back and we summarize and move on, because we still have more things on the list. Hilkach Roveh v'nirba dvar erva. Okay, Roveh v'nirba is going to be disqualified here because, again, you can't bring it to Mishkan Hashem. That's what the whole thing. Why can't you? Because it's dvar erva. It has to do with inappropriate sexual behavior, which is obviously despicable to go on the altar. And again, you have to add that it's a case where first it was sanctified and then it became, it was involved in this action, and that's why it became disqualified, and that's why it's not learned out from the other pasuk, al pnei ol moed, because it could have gone to ol moed. You need the other pasuk, lifnei mishkan Hashem. It's despicable to bring dvar erva lifnei mishkan Hashem. Muktzeh v'ne'evad is also despicable. Why? Clearly, avodah zarah. Okay, we know that, right? It's avodah zarah. Okay, and that you would have to explain b'kodshim kalim, as we said. Etnan umachir kilayim v'yotzei dofen. Now these are a little more complicated. So how are we going to explain these? First of all, kilayim and yotzei dofen is a problem immediately when it's born. You could say kilayim even from conception, right? Kilayim is a mixed breed of an animal that's not rotwed for the mizbech. And yotzei dofen is the way it was born. Okay, and in etna machir, we're also going to have to figure out, because theoretically you could say the same thing as before with the, it's not yours. How can I give away once it's sanctified? How can I give it away as a gift to a prostitute or sell it for a dog? Again, maybe you could say kodshim kalim, but they're going to come up with another answer here. Bivladot kodashim. And you have to add kasavar vladei kodashim v'avatayin him kodoshim. Don't worry, we're not supposed to understand this all yet. I'm going to explain. What's a vlad kodashim? We have to find a case, which is going to be very difficult in the case where it's kilayim or yotzei dofen, for example, where it was ra'oi. Again, in order to understand why they're using this pasuk, we have to find a case where theoretically it could have gone on the altar at some point and then got messed up. Okay, how are we going to do that with kilayim and yotzei dofen? Right, it's a problem in utero. Well, we're going to say like this. Let's say we have an animal that was sanctified and the animal was pregnant. Okay, if the animal is sanctified, pregnant, then it's what's in utero is also somewhat sanctified. Okay, which means, well, there's a machloket, and that's the second line here that I read. There's two approaches here. When does it become sanctified? Okay, so some people say bahavayatan, when they're born. So as soon as it comes out, the vlad is now sanctified. Some people say when they're conceived, all the way back then. Now, if you say they're only sanctified when they're born, we're going to have a good situation here. We're going to be able to find our case. Because what? When the animal is in utero, let's say they sacrifice the mother while the offspring is inside. So the animal, theoretically, in that stage, is way to go on the altar, as a fetus, because the mother can right? We don't care if the mother is carrying a kilayim baby, right? That's the worst case scenario, because right, the other cases are yotzei dofen is going to happen at the birth. Okay, that hasn't even happened yet. Let's say she's carrying a kilayim baby. Okay, she mated with some other animal, some other type of animal. Well, still you could bring her on the altar with the baby in utero, because it's not counted really. So that means that while this offspring is in utero, it's fine, and that it's ra'oi to go on the altar. So there's our case. It's going to be valid on the altar right now for a certain period of time. Could come to Ol Moed as a fetus. But what? Then something happens. So either, let's go with kilayim, that's the easiest. When it's born, and we just said, right, it's now sanctified because it was the vlad of an offspring. Let's say we didn't sacrifice the mother. Now it's born, and now it's sanctified, and it's kilayim. So now it's no good. Okay, so that's going to be a problem. This can't go on the altar now because of Lifnei Mishkan Hashem, and that's why if we bring it outside, you're not going to be liable, because it actually was Ra'oi to Ol Moed at that early stage. Same thing with if it was born C-section, okay, cesarean. So again, it only happened later. There was a time where it was ra'oi, and that's why it's not included in this pasuk, elo moed, and you need the other pasuk. Etnan and mechir would have to be a case where, again, it was in utero, the mother was sanctified, it theoretically could have been brought, and then what happened? Before it was born, so once it's born, it's sanctified, and you can't turn it into a gift for a prostitute because it's not yours anymore. But if we assume this applies to kodesh kodeshim as well. But what can you do theoretically? What if someone promises it a gift to a prostitute while it's in utero? It says, when this animal is born, it will be yours. Now, again, if you hold that the animal is only sanctified at birth, you actually have the rights. Now, first, it was ra'oi to be brought in utero on the altar. So it had a time where it was ra'oi. Then it was promised by its owner to someone as a gift for a prostitute or for a sale of a dog. And then, when it's born, the sanctification hits in because it was the vlad, it was the offspring of a sanctified animal. So that would be a case where if you offer it outside, you're not going to be liable, but not because it couldn't have been brought into Ol Moed, because it could have at that early stage. But it can't now because of Liftei Mishkan Hashem, because now it can't be brought as a sacrifice because of its problem. So now we came up with cases for all of them where you would have a situation where it could theoretically have been, there is a case within every situation, every thing on the list, where it could have been brought to Ol Moed, and that's why they don't learn it from that pasuk. Now we get to the next section. The next section has this machloket in 3 different cases. Today we're going to figure out why were there 3 cases there, between the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon. The issue is what we're going to call, right, it's something that right now is not valid to go on the altar. Okay, we're going to call this later mechusar zman. It's missing time, right? If time will pass, it will eventually be able to go on the altar. Okay, like a blemish that's going to pass, or a bird that's not yet of age, or an animal that hasn't gotten to the 8th day, or an animal whose mother was sacrificed that day. Okay, or the offspring, or the mother whose offspring was sacrificed that day. Okay, maybe father we talked about, but without getting into that. So why do we need? And then Rabbi Shimon's going to say you're actually liable, shchutei chutz, because even though today you couldn't have offered it inside, down the road you will be able to. And the rabbi said no, you're not. Okay, now, but if you remember, Rabbi Shimon says, and this we're going to deal with after, Rabbi Shimon says it's a lo taseh. Okay, this isn't what's important right now. He doesn't say you're liable shchutei chutz from our regular pasuk. He says there's a negative prohibition, but you're not going to get karet. Okay, it's not the usual because you can't really bring it right now. So it's not under the classic, and you're not going to get karet for it, but it is forbidden. And the rabbis say if there's no karet, there's no prohibition. So we're going to have to figure out, and that's the complicated part of today's sugya, is what's the prohibition? Where's the lo taseh of Rabbi Shimon? Because it can't be the same lo taseh of the shchutei chutz one, because then it would be karet. So where does he get this lo taseh? And the rabbis are going to disagree and say that's not a lo taseh about that. Okay, that's why it's going to be complicated, because he has to kind of find some lo taseh, which is not going to be so simple. If it was very simple, the rabbis would have agreed with him. Okay, but first we have to do this sriche. Why do we need all 3 cases? If we had blemished animals, you would say, mishum de me'ise. They're disgusting, right? Despicable. So that's why the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Shimon and say you're not liable for shchutei chutz of something that's totally despicable right now, even though maybe later it won't be. Right now it's despicable, it has a blemish. Aval torin de lo me'ise. But if you just haven't reached the age, you're not despicable. It's just you haven't gotten to the age that you're supposed to be on the altar. Emalo de modele Rabbi Shimon. Maybe they would agree with Rabbi Shimon then that with the torim. Now again, you have to think about the logic. The more they're not despicable, they're theoretically, you could say, well, they can't really go on the altar because they're not of age yet, but it's not like they're disgusting to go on the inner altar. So maybe you are going to be obligated on the outer, right? As long as we limit how severe it is to be brought inside, then maybe we'll actually say, oh, maybe you are liable outside. Because again, the more we say, despicable, no way can you bring it inside, then we're not going to obligate you outside. So that's where they start with the Baalei Mumim. For sure we could say, the rabbis will say it in that case, but they might actually agree with Rabbi Shimon when it's not so bad. V'itana tolim. Now, if you started out with the birds, you would say, why does Rabbi Shimon say what he says there? Mishum de lo chazu ve'idchu. Why are they better to say? Again, the less severe they are, the more likely you're going to say you'll be obligated outside. So Rabbi Shimon's going to say, listen, they're not so bad because it wasn't like they were valid and then became rejected. That's much worse, right? If you haven't yet gotten, like think about if you're underage for something, so you just haven't gotten there yet. But it's different from being there and then getting rejected from there. That's already much more severe. Maybe Rabbi Shimon's going to agree with the rabbis, though, that Baalei Mumim, that actually, what happened? The animal got a blemish that's going to pass. That means that first they weren't blemished. They could have gone on the altar. And now they got completely rejected from the altar. We learned about this whole idea of dichui, right? Once then something's rejected, it can't be brought. Now, mum over is a little different because it's going to go away, so we do allow it eventually. But you might have thought since it was valid and got rejected, maybe it's in a worse position. And again, if it's in a worse position, that means we're not going to obligate you if you bring it outside because it so can't go inside. And last one, itana hani tarite. What if you had those two? You'd say mishum de psula de gufayu. Those things are all a problem in their bodies, right? In other words, you haven't got the right age, or you haven't, or you have a blemish. Avalotova et beno. It's not a psul in your body. That's mishum de psula me'al makatele. It's some other outside prohibition. It's just saying don't do the two on the same day. Ema modele rabbanan the Rabbi Shimon. Maybe it's so not a big deal chiyuv because it's not even a problem in the body of the animal. It's just a problem in, societal problem that there's a mother and an offspring and we don't want to bring them both on the same day. But some outside thing that maybe the rabbis will agree, if you do this outside and you slaughter them both on the same day, maybe you will be obligated. And therefore it's shrichim. So that's why we needed all three of them. Okay, now we're going to get to the next part of our sugya, which I said is a little more complicated, which is how to figure out we're going to try to figure out what the prohibition of Rabbi Shimon is. So Amar Rabbi Eli, Amar Rabbi Rish Lakish, because remember, he's going to say there's a prohibition, it's a negative prohibition. I want to remind you, negative prohibitions, if it doesn't say karet or some specific punishment, then it's lashes. Okay? So basically, Rabbi Shimon thinks that if you do all these things that are what we call mechusar zman, they're not yet its time, and you brought them outside, okay, you can't bring them inside yet, it's too early, but you offer them outside, we're actually going to obligate you. From a lo taseh, not classic shkutei chutz or halat chutz, burning it outside or slaughtering it outside where you're going to get karet. It's some other thing. So where does he get it from? So Rabbi Eli, we're going to have two answers to this question, although the second one we're going to reject. Rabbi Eli says in the name of Rish Lakish, Amakra lo ta'asun kachol asher anachu osim po hayom. This is where Moshe stands in the desert. In Sefer Dvarim, he's giving a speech to the people, and we saw these psukim before. It's in Dvarim chapter 12. This is where we actually saw the source for hala'at chutz, the prohibition, but not in this pasuk. Lo ta'asun kechol asher anachu osim po hayom ish kol hayashar be'enav. Moshe tells the people, when you get into the land, don't do like we do now. Everybody just does whatever he wants, wherever he wants. Because you didn't yet get to the menucha and the nachala. We already explained menucha is Shiloh, right? Meaning only 14 years in are you going to get to where there's really a mishkan and not to the Beit HaMikdash. So now how do we read this pasuk right now? Now notice there's a lo taseh here. Don't do. Okay, that's a lo taseh. Don't do like, right, when you get into the land, don't do what they did, what we've been doing until now. Now, it sounds like he's talking about when you get to, until you get to Shiloh. But now, or we're going to see. So now, Amar lu Moshe Yisrael. How does Rabbi Eli think that, or Rish Lakish, he's saying the name of Rish Lakish, think that Rabbi Shimon's explaining this pasuk, this drasha, or this pasuk. Amar lu Moshe Yisrael. Moshe says to the Jewish people, Ki ailitu la'aretz, when you get to the land, yisharot takrivu, chavot lo takrivu. What are we doing now in the desert, and what's going to continue until you get to Shiloh? And this is really telling you, don't do, when you get to Shiloh, right, don't do what we've been doing until now. But until then, you can continue. What have we been doing now? Ish hayashar beinav. Everybody just does whatever they want. But how does he understand yishal? Yishar is I do whatever I want, which means we're talking about only voluntary offerings, not obligatory. Obligatory is not, I do whatever I want. I'm obligated. So that means that right now, what he's going to say is when you get to the land and you're in Gilgal, okay, where the Mishkan is in Gilgal, you could be wherever, right? You're conquering and then settling. while the Mishkan is in Gilgal, you don't bring obligatory offerings. No chatats, no ashams. Just Isha Yashar Be'enav. In other words, the Isha Yashar Be'enav continues until Shiloh, which means that only Yashar, only voluntary offerings, no obligatory offerings. Now, what's the key here? What does this have to do with anything? Gilgal legabe Shiloh mechusar zmanu. Now, what's Gilgal? If I bring something I'm not supposed to bring, right? I bring it now in Shiloh. Now, it's something that I'm not allowed to bring now, but I could bring later, right? When we get to Shiloh, when the Mishkan gets to Shiloh, I'm allowed to bring it. So all these sacrifices I can't bring in Gilgal, which I now have a negative prohibition about, are basically mechusar zman. And where am I bringing them? Okay, here's the key. So first of all, Rashi points out, just it's kind of obvious, but the second to last line in Rashi, mashma bein bebamat zibur bebamat yachid. Right? It sounds like you can't bring them on any bamot. You can't bring obligatory offerings, right? Like asham, chatat. Okay, I can't bring them not in Gilgal where the Mishkan is, because remember the Mishkan wasn't really permanent there, and the Aron wasn't there because it was going around with them to war, and I can't bring them on the individual offerings. Now, that means basically that there's a lo taseh that basically forbids bringing them on bamot, whether it's bamat yachid, whether it's bamat zibur. Now, bama is chutz. So what do you see here? There's a prohibition to bring things outside, even though they can eventually be brought inside. Okay, that's mechusar zman. So here's a negative prohibition for bringing them outside. And no karet, right, but a prohibition. Okay. Now we're going to have a side point. Okay, because if you think about it, what they're going to say now is, there's two problems with this mechusar zman. Number one is, it's mechusar zman, I'm not supposed to bring it yet, right? And that could be any mechusar zman, like I'm a mitzorah and I haven't brought my korban asham, right? It's not the time to bring my korban asham yet. It's day 5 and not day 8. I could have, it's the animal's 5 days old and not yet 8 days old. I could have, right, all sorts of mechusar zman. It could be, it's not heter bamot yet, right? It's not, right, I'm sorry, it's not, there's no mishkan yet, so I can't bring it until I get to the mishkan, right? That's the case here that we're talking about, where I can't bring a chatat yet because we're not in the mishkan. But we're going to basically assume that this is a general lo ta'asun for anything that I will be able to bring later. Again, that's Rabbi Shimon's position. The rabbis disagree. They just don't think that that's what this pasuk is talking about. That's why I said it's hard to understand. And that's why the rabbis don't read this pasuk this way, because we're taking this pasuk definitely out of context and saying what it really means is don't bring anything on that. There's a prohibition to bring anything outside on a bama if it's not yet its time. Okay, that's basically how they understand it. So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Yirmiyah now goes and questions Rabbi Zera and says, "Ihachi." Now, if so, now he makes a jump. Okay, and that's why it's a bit of a side point. Milka nami lilke. Shouldn't you get lashes for what? Okay, so you have to look in Rashi and you have to look at the comments on Rashi that adds a very important word, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. First of all, Rabbi Shimon does think you get lashes. Okay, we're now at the top of Amud Bet. So Rabbi Shimon's saying you get lashes if you bring an offering, any mechusar zman is what he's learning from this pasuk. Anything that's not yet its time and you brought it outside, you're going to be liable. But that includes also, what if something's mechusar zman and I bring it in the right, inside, okay? Now, what was inside and outside at that time? Outside was bamot, inside was the Mishkan, in Gilgal. Okay, now it's a little tricky, because we're sort of saying, well, you couldn't bring it there either, but let's right now view Gilgal as inside, okay, because that's where the Mishkan is. So they're saying, theoretically, that pasuk is saying, don't bring it outside in the individual ones, right? We saw Rashi said this. And don't bring it inside, even in the big bama, even in, right, the bama gdola is called the Mishkan at that time, just a Mishkan without the Aron. So, theoretically, according to what you're saying, we should say that not only anyone who brings something that's not yet its time and brings it outside is going to be transgressing this negative prohibition and getting lashes, but anyone who brings something inside that it's not yet its time, like an animal on day 5, before it got to 8 days old, you're not allowed to bring, theoretically that animal, if I brought it inside, I should also get lashes for it, right? Theoretically, it's the same. Lo ta'asun. Don't bring something that's not yet its time. That's what it's basically saying. these korbanot chovah, it's not yet its time. Don't bring them even in the Mishkan. So you should get lashes for that, he says to Rabbi Zera. Well, what's the problem? Okay, so you get lashes. But no. Now, this is why it's a total side point, because we're not talking about doing it outside. Obviously, if you do it outside the temple or outside the Mishkan, you're going to be liable and get lashes. But he's saying this same lo taseh that you get lashes for bringing outside is also applying inside. So why did Rabbi Zera say, and now he says to Rabbi Zera, Alama Amar Rabbi Zera, so why did you say, Hakatuv nitko la'aseh? Okay, now we have to understand something else, complete sugya in Chulin. Okay, Rashi quotes the whole thing. I'm not going to go through the whole sugya. But basically, if you look in the Psukim in Vayikra chapter 22, okay, I'm just going to do this outside. It says in verse 23, it's talking about the blemished animals, and it says, Shor v'seh sarua v'kalut, nidavata seuto l'nedro lo yiratzeh. Okay, there's this word, we're not getting into the details of this, but he says, there's a word lo yiratzeh here, negative prohibition, this is not accepted. Okay, so basically what they learn from here is all animals that are not worthy to go on the altar, whether they're blemished or something else, lo yiratzeh, there's a negative prohibition here. However, a few psukim later, in a different section, it says, Shor o kesef o ez ki yivaled. That's where we get, by the way, it has to be a leida regila, when it's born, okay, born natural, otherwise it's not going to be able to go on the altar. That was the yotzei dofen, the cesarean. But that's not what's important now. V'haya shivat yamim tachad imo. This is what we talked about before. It should be 7 days under its mother. Umiyam hashmini v'hala yeratzeh. Notice the same word, yeratzeh, but worded in the positive. It will be accepted l'korbani shel Hashem, meaning from the 8th day an animal will be accepted as a korban. Notice it doesn't say anything negative here. It just says first 7 days with its mother, 8th day it will be accepted. Rabbi Zera in the Gemara in Chulin says, it says lo yeratzeh, okay, he says here, I'm going to read in Rashi for a minute in the middle, he calls this katuv nitko la'aseh. Don't get confused between this and a lav nitak la'aseh. That's a little different. That's when you mess something up, like you leave the meat beyond the designated time, it says it has to be burned in the fire. You're not going to get lashes for that because there's a mistake you did and there's a correction to it. So when there's a correction, you don't get lashes. That's something different. Here they're saying the katuv separated it from the previous. Even though theoretically it should have been under lo yeratzeh, the negative, it nitko la'aseh. It basically switched it into a positive formulation. Dichtive aseh yetera. There's this. It didn't need to say yeratzeh. Okay, why did it say that? To basically say you don't get lashes for it. Okay, so basically, what does this mean? It means that this pasuk teaches you if it's mechusar zman. Rabbi Zera teaches us about it. If it's mechusar zman, it can't be brought yet, like only on day 8, and you bring it on day 7 or day 6 or day 5, whatever it is. You're not going to get lashes for it. Now, what's that? Bringing it inside. So what do you see here? Rabbi Zera said, if you bring it inside, you don't get lashes. And the way we explain Rabbi Shimon is that it's based on this lo ta'asun, which would apply inside and outside. And there should be a negative prohibition. So while it's very nice, it says yeratzeh in the positive formulation. And Rabbi Zera said there's no lashes. But now, okay, and Rashi says, I'm just going to read the very end of Rashi. He says it very well. It's very nice, it's positive formulation over there. But now that you added this lo ta'asun, there's a negative prohibition. You should get lashes for it. So, Rabbi Zera, what's going on here? Why did you say no lashes if we have this explanation of lo ta'asun? So the first answer is very easy. 2 answers to this question. Hanami leila Rabbana and the Rabbi Shimon hachinami. Rabbi Zera was talking according to the rabbis. Remember, the rabbis don't think lo ta'asun is talking about this. That's very simple. So Rabbi Zera was talking all according to the rabbi's position. It says there is no lo ta'asun. This isn't what you think it's talking about. It's not talking about things that are mechusar zman that can't yet come on the altar and then you put them on outside and then therefore also inside. It's not even talking about that. So of course there's no negative prohibition. Or Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, here's where it complicates things a little bit, but it's not so complicated. Now, what did we think? We thought that since it's saying you can't even bring it in Gilgal where the Mishkan is, it means you can't bring it inside either. But if you think about what we said in the beginning, that Gilgal is really considered outside. Right? You can't bring any chovot there because you haven't yet gotten to Shiloh. Shiloh, even though it didn't exist yet, the Mishkan in Shiloh, but Shiloh is inside and Gilgal is outside. Okay? So therefore, this pasuk is only talking about outside, and that's why there's only lashes for outside. There's no lashes if you did it inside. So, let's just read it inside. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Pnim de Gilgal legabe Shiloh kechutz dami. Okay, inside Gilgal is basically like outside, as relates to these korbanot that you can't bring in Gilgal. Since you can't bring them in Gilgal, so Gilgal is considered being in a bama outside. Outside of what? Outside of the Mishkan and Shiloh, which didn't exist yet. So it's a bit of a weird chutz, because there is no pnim in that time, really. Okay, it's a little confusing. But basically, we started off thinking, and this is what's important to understand, okay, let's just get what's really important and what's peripheral. Because the real important thing is saying, lo ta'asun is basically coming to say, things that have not yet reached their time, like these obligatory offerings, chata and asham, can't be brought yet until we get to Shiloh. So bringing them outside, which is on any bama, right, is forbidden. That's the lo taseh. That's Rabbi Shimon. That's the first important point to get in this. There we have our negative prohibition according to Rabbi Shimon. It's from lo tasun. Comes the Gemara and asks, but wait, and Rabbi Yirmiyah really asked this question. He says, wait a minute. But basically, Gilgal is where the Mishkan is. You can't bring it on the bamot, anyone who does a bama on their own house, on their own roof, but you also can't do it in the Mishkan, in the Gilgal. Well, that sounds like it's pnim also. The prohibition applies also to bringing something that's not yet its time inside. And Rabbi Zera, you yourself said there's no lashes for that, because you said if you bring an animal on day 4, there's no lashes because the Katuv worded it in the positive. But here's a negative formulation. It should be lashes. So either he just doesn't hold of Rabbi Shimon, or maybe we misunderstood the case in the first place. And it's really only chutz, because Gilgal is really chutz compared to Shiloh. And then it has nothing to do with pnim. And that was just answering the side question about why there are no lashes, the side question of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Okay? So that's all a side point. We still have lo tasun as a negative prohibition with lashes for bringing something that's not yet its time, but bringing it outside. And that we learn from that pasuk. Rabbi is going to bring a different pasuk. Rabbi Amar, Tami de Rabbi Shimon kedetanya. Rabbi Shimon Omer. It's going to take a few lines to build up till we realize the connection. Minayin lezovech pesach bebamat yachid b'shad isur bamot shu b'lo taseh. How do you know that if you offer up a pesach in the bama, okay, in your own rooftop, okay, I say roofs because they say like the bamot were on the roofs, okay, there's psukim about that, but anyway, when bamot are forbidden, meaning when there's a central place, how do you know that that's forbidden, okay? When there's a central place to offer bamot. This is going to be a little, to offer on bamot, it's a little strange, it's forbidden anyway to offer on bamot. We'll talk about that in a minute, okay, right? You don't need a special pasuk for the korban pesach. You can't do it on a bama, you can't do any korban on a bama when there's bamot forbidden. So there's something a little weird about this. Talmud Lamal, lo tuchal lizbach et pasach. Okay, here's a pasuk in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 16. You can't sacrifice the pesach be'echad sha'arecha, in one of your gates. Okay? Asher Hashem lokach natamach. Okay, so basically, you can't sacrifice in one of your gates. Sounds like when there's a temple, you're not allowed to sacrifice the pesach anywhere you want. Yachol af b'shat heter bamot katuv ken. Maybe it's telling you, which actually makes more sense, that when you're allowed to sacrifice anywhere you want, you just can't do the pesach anywhere you want. Okay, it's not the kind of korban you could just do anywhere you want. But they say can't be talking about that because Talmud Lamar be'echad sha'arecha. You can't do it in one of your gates. What are they darshan from this? Lo amarti l'cha ela b'shasha kol Yisrael nechnesim b'shar echad. You can't do it in one of your gates when everyone else does it in one particular gate. That's the drashana. Why did they say in one of your gates? It wanted to say, well, you can't do it when there's a time when everybody goes through one gate into the temple, basically. So when there's a central place. Okay, but now we have to figure out what this is talking about. Emat. When exactly are we doing this korban pesach that you're going to get this lo taseh? Because inema achar chatzot, if you're going to say, I'm standing on the 14th in the afternoon when the korban pesach is supposed to be sacrificed, and I do it outside. Okay, well, karet nami mechayev. That's classic shchutei chutz. I'm going to get karet for it. Forget this, measly lo taseh negative prohibition. I'm going to get karet for it already for shchutei chutz. I don't need another pasuk to tell me that. This is what I was getting at before. Right? It makes no sense. Of course I'm obligated if there's isur bamot and it's the day I'm supposed to bring the pesach and I bring it outside. Of course I'm liable. Elalav kodem chatzot. It must be before chatzot. Okay, meaning it's not a time when I'm supposed to do the korban pesach. What is it? Mechusar zman, ding, ding, ding. We found what we were looking for. It's the day before, let's say. I'm not supposed to yet bring it. I bring it outside, I'm liable. What do you see from here? It's setting up a paradigm. Any mechusar zman, anything that I can't really bring yet, and I offer it outside, I'm going to get a negative. It's a negative prohibition. And that's the source for Rabbi Shimon. However, the Gemara is going to reject this because it says, what do you mean? You could say la'olam achar chatzot. It really is after chatzot. Well, we had a problem, but it was isur bamot and it's kareh. B'shat heter bamot kai. It's actually talking about heter bamot, and this is the way usually people understand this pasuk. It's saying when bamot are permitted, you cannot do the Pesach anywhere you want. When there are bamot, and you can bring other sacrifices, just like we saw before. You can't bring obligatory offerings. This is like that. You can't bring the Pesach on outside in the bamot. Okay, well, that sounds nice, but that's not what he said. V'ha b'shat isur habamot ka'amal. It said, when bamot are asurim, look at the words. Rabbi Shimon says, how do you know if you do the Pesach b'bamat yachid b'shat isur bamot, when bamot are forbidden? How can you possibly say it's when bamot are permitted? They say, isur bama lo, heter bama l'chavero. It's when bamot are forbidden for you, for the Pesach, because Pesach is never permitted in bamot. It might be shat heter bamot for other people to do other sacrifices, but for you in the Pesach, you can't do Pesach. Pesach is constant isur bamot. There's always isur bamot for Pesach, because that's what this pasuk is telling you. You can never ever do the Pesach outside the central place. Has to be slaughtered in whatever central place you have. And then this has absolutely nothing to do with mechusar zman being brought outside. And then that falls aside that proof. Okay, now we're getting to the last two sections of our daf. Mechusar zman. Now the Mishnah had started talking about mechusar zman for a korban, like a case of your zav, zava, yoledet, and a mitzorah. That's slaughter, they're chatat, they're asham b'chutz, they're going to be pturim, but they're ola and shlamim outside, they're actually going to be chayavim. Okay, because ola and shlamim can always be brought at any time. But these, the chatat and asham, are brought only on day number 8. So, first you have to understand this is all a girsa problem. In the Mishnah that the Amoraim had in front of them, it just said zav, zavan, yoledet. Now, zav, zavan, yoledet bring two things, an ola and a chatat. They never bring an asham, and they never bring a chatat. So what are we talking about here? Okay? I'm sorry. They never bring an asham. They bring an ola and a chatat. They never bring an asham. They never bring a shlamim. So why is it talking about asham and shlamim in the Mishnah? Okay? So they say, V'hane b'nei ashamot ninu, they don't bring an asham. So Amar Ze'eri, Tnei Mitzorah Bahadayu. A Mitzorah brings also an asham. Okay? We've talked a lot of times about the asham Mitzorah. Okay? So add Mitzorah to the Mishnah, which actually is what we have. Now we have another problem. They say, Olotayim v'shlamehen, you'll be chayav because you could have brought them inside even though it's too early, because you can always bring a shlamim and an ola inside. Hani b'nei shlamim ninu, but none of these bring shlamim, not mitzorah, not zav, zava yoledet. Amrav sheshe, tenei nazir bahadayu. Add nazir to the list. Now nazir didn't appear. Now when nazir brings a shlamim, nazir didn't appear in our Mishnah, if you notice. So now the Gemara tells us, Amrav sheshe, I'm sorry, does the eri kava'u tanai? The Rav sheshe lo kava'u tanai. For whatever reason, we don't know why. Ze'eris, they then added to their text of the Mishnah, and that's why it appears by us. But Rav Sheshet, they didn't add. So they didn't amend the Mishnah according to Rav Sheshet's suggestion to add Nazir, and that's why the version that we have printed includes Mitzorah, which was later added to the Mishnah, but doesn't include Nazir for whatever reason. Okay, we're going to end with Rav Chilkiah Debei Rav Tuvi. Now it said there that an Asha Mitzorah that you bring too early, right? You're not chayiv. That was what we said. It's mechusar zman, right? It's not yet the day. You bring it outside, you're not liable. But he says, lo shanu ela lishmo. He's going to start adding a whole other thing back to our first Mishnah in the Masechet. If you bring an asham shelo lishma, unless you're Rabbi Eliezer, but putting him aside, if you bring an asham shelo lishma, so you bring it as an ola, sacrifice as an ola. So what does he say? If you sacrifice it outside the shem asham on day 5, okay, which you're supposed to wait till day 8, again, any day, I'm just randomly picking 5, then you're not going to be liable for shchutei chutz. But shelo lishmo, let's say you slaughter it shelo lishmo. Shelo lishmo basically is an ola. Or let's say you did it for a shlamim. Let's say you just say you did it for an ola. It's accepted as an ola. So now, that could have been brought inside, so you're liable outside. Now this is a little bit ironic. If you do it the wrong way, it's actually going to be, well, better but worse, right? Better, more like a korban, because it could have been brought inside, and therefore you're going to be liable for shchutei chutz. Because if you had done that inside, taken this asham that's not yet due, but brought it as an ola inside, it actually would have been accepted. So now the Gemara has some questions. Well, then you should be liable if I offer this asham on day 5 outside as an asham. You could also say, Well, theoretically, you could have brought it inside, shalol lishma, and it would have worked, so therefore you're going to be liable outside. To which they say, no, baya kira. It needs a big change. You need to change its whole designation from asham to shlamim, obviously, to ola. It doesn't take much to do, but it's renaming it, right? Right now it's an asham, and it's not yet due, so no, we're not going to make you liable for doing that outside, lishma. But matkif la Rav Huna says, wait, but you're basically saying something crazy here. You're basically saying, because remember, outside is all based on what's true inside. So what you're saying is, if I take my asham on day 5, and I bring it inside, and I offer it inside as an asham, it's not accepted, because it's not yet its time. But if I do it shalol lishma, it's accepted. So he says, yesh davar she'eino kasher lishmo v'kasher shalol lishmo. You're basically saying something, if I did it right, it would be wrong, and if I did it wrong, it would be right. That's absurd. So we're ending with that absurd question, and we'll see what the Gemara does with this tomorrow. So we did today, we went through that list of Rovei and Nirba, all those psulim, and said, why did they just learn it from Pnei Ol Moed Lo Evio? Petach Ol Moed Lo Evio. Why didn't we say that? Why did we need some other thing? We gave a case for each one, some way that we couldn't have learned it from there. We went to why we have the 3 cases where Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis disagree and why you needed all 3. From there we went to what's the source for Rabbi Shimon, what's the negative prohibition that he has, it doesn't have karet, for all these cases that mechusar zman, they're not yet its time, but since they will be valid later. Okay, and that we had whole discussion about, but we had either lo tasun or lo tuchal lizboch et Pesach, which we basically rejected the second one. And then we had to re-edit the Mishnah because, right, add in Mitzorah and add in Nazir, because otherwise the Asham and the Shlamim make no sense. And even though they didn't really accept the Nazir edit. And then we just ended with Rav Chilkiah about this whole thing of the Asham being sacrificed too early, not being liable outside is only if you do it Lishma. But if you do it Shalol Lishma, which is counterintuitive, it's actually going to be more, it could have been valid inside, so you'll actually be liable outside. And then we can start with some questions on that, and we'll pick up with there tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day.